as well. When even the imagery they probably use on the packaging as well, like for whether it's dairy and they have like a happy cow on it or something, whereas the reality is quite different. And some people might think, oh, that's just in the most intense or extreme cases. But from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that is the majority. That's like over 80% of what, at least in the case of pigs and chickens.
Yeah, so I mean the typical livestock farm, and I'm referring to cattle and sheep predominantly. The typical livestock farm in the UK is probably less than 100 head of. Let's say it's a beef herd. It's probably less than 100. It's probably around 40 or 50, or maybe even less than that. And you know, most of that meat is being. There's not that many abattoirs left. So those have become centralised, and the small family abattoirs have closed down. And if they're in a contract with a supermarket, then those animals get mixed with lots of other animals, and then they end up on the shelf. Right. And the consumer doesn't really know at this point, other than organic certification. There's very little relationship between how that food was grown and its husbandry and the consumer's awareness of that.
Right.
In the case of, let's say, our poultry production systems in the UK, those are highly intensive. We know that those are all, the animals are in confinement, and then the food is brought to them, and the food can come from around the world. Right. And that soy can potentially be coming from very badly managed or even land that's deforested in Brazil, although there are regulations that have tried to curb that. I think that the Brazilian government is actually unravelling a moratorium on deforested soy at the moment, which is going to cause quite a lot of controversy. Anyway, I digress. There's so many different sort of rabbit holes that you can go down into.
Well, just because I think we should come back. It is an interesting one looking at the commodity supply chain. But just if we go back to farm washing, if you think that 80% and the figures sort of 10% one way or the other, it might be more, of the UK buys the entirety of their food from 5 major supermarkets, and those supermarkets are being done at the moment for farm washing. So you buy a punnet of blueberries, it comes from a Tesco own brand blueberries, it comes from Wave Hill Farms or something, forgetting what the actual name is. That's being deemed as misleading at the moment, and they're having to shift that. But
where are they coming from, really?
They're coming from industrialized farms in Chile, Portugal, Spain, South Africa.
So they're being imported, but they're being shown as if they're some UK...
Well, whether it's UK or not, but definitely they're being the picture of a sort of bucolic British farm is what's being summoned. And that's across most fresh produce. You know, if you think that there's very limited fresh produce in a supermarket, it's really the outside section.
Sure.
And so we think how can we begin to shift a British food system, or indeed a global food system? And you think, at the moment, Professor Tim Lang is the man to speak to you about food systems, and Professor Tim Benton. At the moment, 56% of UK diet is ultra-processed. Obviously, that's an average. So if you were to go to some of the food deserts, like Blackburn, Lancashire, for instance, where it's pretty difficult to find a whole food meal affordably, much easier to buy some fried chicken and chips. How can you begin to A, create access, B, shift a food culture, C, get perhaps a mum in charge of a single mum in charge of 5 kids who've got very accustomed to eating in a particular way to suddenly eat some peas and carrots is an enormous complex hurdle. People like Henry Dimbleby with their National Food Strategy and his most recent bill that's about to be published, which was delayed because of the farmer protests, lays out pretty good processes to get there. Ultimately, there will have to be some kind of legislation, taxation, in the same way as the smoking ban, which is highly contentious because it's really penalising low-income people in a far more aggressive way than others. And there are solutions.
Because it's just so affordable, the highly processed frozen food stuff.
And it tastes so good.
Yeah.
We've had teams of the best flavour scientists working on how to formulate these incredible salt, fat, sugar combinations.
Plus mouth feel, all that stuff.
Yes, even like the sound of the Pringle pot or the Coca-Cola thing, it's sonic advertising. And they've been doing this, snap, crackle and pop since the 60s. Everyone used to hold a bowl next to their thing. And sorry, I know you want to quite rightly jump in, but it's far more insidious than one can really even believe, not just in terms of taste, where the best scientists were involved, and some of those now Simon and I speak to are being employed by companies that are beginning to look at nutritional profiling, something like Wild Farmed, and these scientists who've been working, I suppose, to create a sense of nutrition, but knowing that what they're promoting is nutritionally void, are now going to companies where they have been using sensible methods and are now able to start working. Flavors are obviously a very good predicator for nutrient density. So flavonoids and terpenes are things, aspects of food that are good for us, often also denote lots of flavor. But I suppose, I've lost my train of thought.
I was just going to add to your point about pervasiveness, but extend it from ultra-processed foods to whole foods in the industrial sort of supermarket setup. So there's a reason that all of the bacon looks exactly the same, and there's a reason that all the chickens look exactly the same. They're pretty much all the same weight when they're slaughtered. That's so that they can fit into machines that can process that at line speed.
Right.
So the industrial bacon slicer is calibrated to a certain size. That then produces a downstream consequence, which is that all of the pigs have to look the same, have to be the same breed, and they have to be managed in the same way. And that rewards the industrial production mechanistic system. So if you're raising a chicken in a controlled environment, which is what a shed is, you provide it with a calorie regime and a protein, fat, carbohydrate regime that gets it to a certain weight at a certain day to be slaughtered in order to meet the demands of us buying those things from the supermarket.
Right. Standardized, everything.
Everything's standardized.
Yeah.
The tomatoes that are grown in those Dutch warehouses, I hope I'm not overstepping the bounds, but I do understand still that it's quite common practice to spray a light fungicide on many of these vegetables post-harvest in order that there can be some guarantee that when that produce hits the shelf, it still looks fresh and is of a certain quality, and then, of course, then we're ingesting it. So, the system is entirely pervasive. If you're outside of that system and you're trying to carve a different path, so let's say you're a farmer trying to grow regeneratively and sell direct, well, you can do that, because if you can find a market for your delicious produce, then your cattle don't have to hit a certain weight by a certain date for you to have a functional business. But as soon as you're playing into large-scale buyers, or you're trying to sell into the commodity market, you're certainly not going to be able to claim this premium on your exceptional produce, which you've grown regeneratively. But in a sense, the fact that these hurdles and these obstacles look so insurmountable is not stopping the innovation that Chris and I are looking at and that we're backing. Although everything is very, very challenging, there are still massive opportunities to create